Hello and welcome everyone to today's video. Today I'd like to talk about the mysterious nations of Gog and Magog and their role in the end times. Now, this topic relates to a topic that I had previously mentioned in another video. This idea that the millennial reign of Jesus Christ has already happened, and the idea that we are further along in the biblical timeline than what we have been led on to believe. I don't want to go into too much detail here and now. Instead, I want to encourage you to go to the link that you see on your screen for more information. Right now, I'd like to go to chapter 20 of the book of Revelation, more specifically chapter 20, verses 7 through 9, where it mentions that Satan is to be loosed out of his prison at the end of this 1,000 years. And verse 8 goes on to say, "And shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea." Now, people have gone on to wonder, what is the identity of this mysterious Gog and Magog, and how will they be assembled to fight against this camp of the saints? In this video, I'd like to take a look at some biblical and extra biblical references on the identity of Gog and Magog. First, we'll take a look at the book of Genesis, where a man named Magog is mentioned as being one of the descendants of Japheth, Japheth being one of the three sons of Noah. Unfortunately, we don't get too much detail about Magog specifically, just some additional information on Japheth's lineage in general. If we move forward in the Old Testament, you get a mention of a Gog and Magog in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. In chapter 38, Gog is named as the land of Magog. Magog is mentioned as being the chief prince of Mesech and Tubal. And in chapter 39, it states, "I will send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am the Lord." So here we see Magog and his associates being declared as enemies of God, essentially, and their fate is being set ablaze by God, which mirrors what you read in the book of Revelation. So I find it interesting that you have a Gog and Magog being set ablaze in Ezekiel and Revelation in some sort of dual prophecy. Now, looking outside the Bible, you do have texts that make specific mention to the Gog and Magog of the end times. Now, at the start, I understand that many have reservations about these types of sources, understandably so, but I think that they bring up some topics and ideas that are noteworthy. So, starting off with this one, the Book of the Bee. In this book, Gog and Magog are described as descendants of Japheth that are sealed in this north that isn't described with too much detail by Alexander the Great. They're described as being unacquainted with power of reason, and they're basically described as man-eating beasts that have no understanding of God. Unfortunately, we are not told how they ended up like this. Some of the tribes mentioned being sealed up with Gog and Magog are Ashkenaz, cannibals, Huns, Thracians, Drakes, and Cynocephaly. Next, we'll take a look at Prester John's letter that he allegedly wrote in 1165. Here you have the same narrative that Gog and Magog have been sealed up by Alexander the Great along with other tribes. In the letter, Prester John speaks as if he has some measure of control over these tribes. And John also mentions that these tribes will burst forth from the four quarters of the earth in the times of the Antichrist. Lastly, the tribes will not stand in judgment and will be burnt to ashes for their actions, which reflects what we read in Revelation chapter 20. As a common thread through these texts is the Alexander romance, which is the story of Alexander the Great and his travels throughout the world with his armies. Now, when you read the Greek translation of the Alexander romance, it states that Alexander interacts with Gog and Magog and these other nations and prays to God to seal these nations behind mountains called the Breasts of the North. Also, when you read the book Travels of Sir Mandeville, allegedly written in 1356, it expands on the romance, stating that 22 kings, along with their people, were sealed behind the mountains of Scythia. And after Alexander the Great prayed to God, these great mountains moved to seal these nations away. So, with all of that said, and Gog and Magog being established as some sort of raiding and marauding tribe that perhaps was sealed away at some point, my next question is, where are Gog and Magog today? Well, first, let's go back to the invasions of the Roman Empire in the first millennium. These invasions are said to be one of the reasons why the Western Roman Empire collapsed, which to me ties in with the idea that most of the events of Revelation already happened. But also, these tribes are mentioned as being descendants of Japheth, according to writers like Jerome and Isidore of Seville. With this listing, I also find it interesting that many of the nations found in Europe today are described as being descendants of Japheth. Like, for example, you have the Irishmen, the Finns, Norsemen, Scandinavians, according to Jerome and Isidore of Seville, are descendants of Japheth. What's also interesting about this is that even in Nazi Germany, you have the connection between Western Europeans and Japheth. You have this writer, Albert Gorder, who describes Aryans as one of the three branches of the Caucasian race, and they're also described as being descendants of Japheth. So you have some connections between Japheth and his descendants, Europe and Western Asia, and Gog and Magog. Which brings me to my final point. Starting with Columbus, allegedly, you have European nations traveling to North and South America to colonize and populate these lands. So much so that you have massive European diaspora in North and South America. Which brings me to my final question. Have Gog and Magog been gathered into the Americas? Now, I don't ask this question to incite a race war. In fact, I think we've all been misled on skin color for a very long time. I ask this question because I think the evil one has been covertly amassing his forces amongst plenty of innocent people. And this type of information is now coming to light. Food for thought. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for your time.